Quick disclaimer and content disclosure, we talk about incest, suicide, and child death in this video, so please take care of yourself. Hi everyone! We made it to the final video in the Frankenstein series. Huzzah! If you've been with me the past 9 weeks, I hope this conclusion will provide you with valuable thoughts, answers, and more questions to answer for yourself about the major themes introduced in Mary Shelley's masterpiece. And if you just dropped in for this video, welcome! I hope you've read Frankenstein, but if you haven't, check out the rest of the series where I read the whole novel aloud and discuss it over the course of 9 videos, this one being the 10th and final. I also want to state up front that I feel like I am only skimming the surface in terms of analysis and exploration of Mary Shelley's life and the many ways Frankenstein has affected culture and literature since she wrote it. I wish I could have put this video off longer so that I could make it even more complete, but I think that's just how it was always going to be. No matter how much you learn about something, there's just always more to know. That being said, I will be bopping around to a myriad of topics in this video, and I have put timestamps in the caption for anyone who wants to hop directly to what interests them. So Frankenstein was published anonymously in 1818 to mixed reviews. I want to take some time to read and dissect some of these early reviews, notably the ones that came out before Mary Shelley's name was attached to it. In the Quarterly Review, which came out in January of 1818, very shortly after the novel debuted, John Wilson Croker gives a summary of the novel, and then says, "Our readers will guess from this summary what a tissue of horrible and disgusting absurdity this work presents. It is piously dedicated to Mr. Godwin, and is written in the spirit of his school. The dreams of insanity are embodied in the strong and striking language of the insane, and the author, notwithstanding the rationality of his preface, often leaves us in doubt whether he is not as mad as his hero. Mr. Godwin is the patriarch of a literary family, whose chief skill is in delineating the wanderings of the intellect, and which strangely delights in the most afflicting and humiliating of human miseries. His disciples are a kind of out-pensioners of Bedlam, and, like Mad Bess or Mad Tom, are occasionally visited with paroxysms of genius and fits of expression which make sober-minded people wonder and shudder." Then he goes on to give readers a taste of the prose, quoting 3 separate passages throughout the novel. And then he says, "It cannot be denied that this is nonsense, but it is nonsense decked out with circumstance and clothed in language highly terrific. It is, indeed, a tale, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. But still there is something tremendous in the unmeaning hollowness of its sound, and the vague obscurity of its images. But when we have thus admitted that Frankenstein has passages which appall the mind and make the flesh creep, we have given it all the praise, if praise it can be called, which we dare to bestow. Our taste and our judgment alike revolt at this kind of writing, and the greater the ability with which it may be executed, the worse it is. It inculates no lesson of conduct, manners, or morality. It cannot mend, and it will not even amuse its readers unless their tastes have been deplorably vitiated. It fatigues the feelings without interesting the understanding, it gratuitously harasses the heart, and wantonly adds to the store, already too great, of painful sensations. The author has powers, both of conception and language, which employed in a happier direction might, perhaps, we speak dubiously, give him a name among those whose writings amuse or amend their fellow creatures. But we take the liberty of assuring him, and hope that he may be in a temper to listen to us, that the style which he has adopted in the present publication merely tends to defeat his own purpose, if he really had any other object in view than that of leaving the wearied reader, after a struggle between laughter and loathing, in doubt whether the head or the heart of the author be the most diseased. What this review lacks in punctuation that allows me to take a breath, it makes up for in veiled compliments. Croker asserts the skill and vivacity of the writing while denouncing its immorality and the emotional toll it takes on the reader. If I was Mary, I would have taken this one as a W. Sometimes critics just need to say that a piece wasn't to their tastes, and that's okay. Frankenstein is for the freaks, and that's fine. La Belle Assembly came out with a review in March of 1818, and it began with, "This is a very bold fiction, and did not the author, in a short preface, make a kind of apology, we should almost pronounce it to be impious. We hope, however, the writer had the moral in view which we are desirous of drawing from it, that the presumptive works of man must be frightful, vile, and horrible, ending only in discomfort and misery to himself. But will all our readers understand this? Should not an author who has a moral end in view point out rather that application which may be more generally understood? We recommend, however, to our fair readers who may peruse a work which, from its originality, excellence of language, and peculiar interest, is likely to be very popular, to draw from it that meaning which we have cited above. This review is funny to me because, similarly to the last review, it betrays the Victorian sensibilities that Percy was trying to fend off in the preface he wrote. He and Mary knew that there would be moral qualms amongst the Victorian readership, so I'm sure this review didn't come as much of a surprise. I think it's funny that it's like, we might kinda recommend this book as long as our readers draw the same moral we did from it. In Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in March 1818, Walter Scott wrote a lengthy review, and I'll quote a little of it here. "So concludes this extraordinary tale, in which the author seems to us to disclose uncommon powers of poetic imagination. The feeling with which we peruse the unexpected and fearful event, very natural conclusion of Frankenstein's experiment, shook little even our firm nerves, although such and so numerous have been the expedients for exciting terror employed by the romantic writers of the age, that the reader may adopt Macbeth's words with a slight alteration. We have supped full with horrors. Direness, familiar to our callous thoughts, cannot once startle us. It is no slight merit in our eyes that the tale, though wild in incident, is written in plain and forcible English, without exhibiting that mixture of hyperbolical Germanisms with which tales of wonder are usually told, as if it were necessary that the language should be as extravagant as the fiction. The ideas of the author are always clearly as well as forcibly expressed, and his descriptions of landscapes have in them the choice requisites of truth, freshness, precision, and beauty." You know, if I had a nickel for every time an early review of Frankenstein quotes Macbeth, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. I also found this early review in April 1818 in The British Critic, which seems to have heard the rumor that Frankenstein was written by a woman, but still doesn't know it was Mary. It says this: "We need scarcely say that these volumes have neither principle, object, nor moral. The horror which abounds in them is too grotesque and bizarre ever to approach near the sublime. And when we did not hurry over the pages in disgust, we sometimes paused to laugh outright. And yet we suspect that the diseased and wandering imagination, which has stepped out of all legitimate bounds to frame these disjointed combinations and unnatural adventures, might be disciplined into something better. We heartily wish it were so, for there are occasional symptoms of no common powers of mind struggling through a mass of absurdity, which well nigh overwhelms them. But it is a sort of absurdity that approaches so often the confines of what is wicked and immoral that we dare hardly trust ourselves to bestow even this qualified praise. The writer of it, we understand, is a female. This is an aggravation of that which is the prevailing fault of the novel. But if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, it is no reason why we should, and we shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment." I'm kind of obsessed with bad reviews that also have praise in them. They're like, she's brilliant, but she's kind of up. Oh, may we all be so lucky. A shorter review in the Gentleman's Magazine, published in April 1818, begins with, "This tale is evidently the production of no ordinary writer, and though we are shocked at the idea of the event on which the fiction is founded, many parts of it are strikingly good, and the description of the scenery is excellent." I think it's important to remind ourselves that the Victorians reading this had very little familiarity with the type of story that Frankenstein was. The earliest Gothic horror novel was written in 1764, and science fiction wasn't really a thing yet. Frankenstein kind of pioneered that. Some might argue that Frankenstein was the first science fiction novel. Debate in the comments. We, as readers in 2025, have tons of cultural and literary context for Frankenstein. Its influence is inescapable, but that was not the case for the Victorian reader. We are familiar with the tropes that were made popular by Frankenstein, the mad scientist trope and the reanimation of the dead trope. So those things aren't as shocking or novel to us reading it now, but those things were wholly new for the 1818 audience. It should be noted that Percy also wrote an early review of Frankenstein, but it remained unpublished until after the 3rd edition of Frankenstein came out in 1831, by which time, spoiler alert, Percy was already dead. From what I understand, it was not an uncommon practice for writers to anonymously publish reviews of their own work, which I think is absolutely hilarious and honestly smart. So Percy writing one for Mary's work would not have been out of the ordinary. I'll put a link to his review in the caption. In 1824, a review was published in Knight's Quarterly after Mary had owned the novel that very eloquently and emotionally touches on my own experience reading the book. It says, "For my own part, I confess that my interest in the book is entirely on the side of the monster. His eloquence and persuasion, of which Frankenstein complains, are so because they are truth. The justice is indisputably on his side, and his sufferings are, to me, touching to the last degree. Are there any sufferings, indeed, so severe as those which arise from the sensation of dereliction, or, as in this case, of isolation? Even the slightest tinge of those feelings, arising as they often do from trivial circumstances, as from passing a solitary evening in a lone and distant situation, even these are bitter to a severe degree. What it must be, then! What is it to feel oneself alone in the world? Fellow feeling is the deepest of all the needs which nature has implanted within us. The impulses which lead us to the physical preservation of our life are scarcely stronger than those which impel us to communion with our fellows. Alas! Then to have no fellows! To be, with feelings of kindliness and beneficence, the object of scorn and hate to everyone whose eyes lighted on us? To be repaid with blows and wounds for the very benefits we confer? The poor monster, always, for these reasons, touched me to the heart. Frankenstein ought to have reflected on the means of giving happiness to the being of his creation before he did create him. Instead of that, he heaps on him all sorts of abuse and contumely for his ugliness, which was directly his work, and for his crimes, to which his neglect gave rise. I'll talk more about Victor's responsibility and his thoughtlessness a little later. There have also been debates over the years about just how much Percy Shelley contributed to the novel. There was an 1824 comparison between Frankenstein and Mary's 1823 novel Valperga, where an anonymous reviewer in Knight's Quarterly Review says, But whence arises the extreme inferiority of Valperga? I can account for it only by supposing that Shelley, as in Percy, wrote the first, though it was attributed to his wife, and that she really wrote the last. Still, I should not, from internal evidence, suppose Frankenstein to be the work of Shelley, as in Percy. It has much of his poetry and vigor, but it is wholly free from those philosophical opinions from which scarcely any of his works are free, and for which there are many fair openings in Frankenstein. It is equally to be observed that there are no religious reflections, and that there are many circumstances in which a mind at all religiously inclined would not have failed to have expressed some sentiments of that nature. It may be that Mrs. Shelley wrote Frankenstein, but knowing that its fault was extravagance, determined to be careful and correct in her next work, and thence, as so many do from the same cause, became cold and commonplace. At all events, the difference of the two books is very remarkable. Here it entertains, but ultimately discredits the idea that Percy wrote Frankenstein, because it was lacking many of Percy's philosophical trademarks. He was a noted atheist, and there are many places he could have inserted those opinions, and would have if he had been the author. It is now widely accepted by most competent scholars that Percy contributed about 3,000 to 5,000 of the 72,000-word novel, but that is all. He acted primarily as an editor. In the Shelley Godwin archives, you can view scans of Mary's original handwritten manuscript with Percy's notes and edits clearly differentiated. Many take this as proof of her authorship, but others are not convinced that Percy didn't dictate to Mary and then made the handwritten final edits himself. The same issues that plague the Shakespeare authorship debate are present here. Someone like that couldn't possibly have the skill to write something like this is a classist, and in Mary's case, a sexist, and narrow-minded view of the world, because geniuses are born everywhere. Also, Mary was the daughter of two of the most famous writers in England at the time. While her education wasn't very formal, she was constantly surrounded by brilliance growing up, so it should be no surprise to anyone that she was brilliant herself, unless you're a misogynist and don't think women are as smart as men as a baseline. Additionally, whenever someone is serious about being an Oxfordian, or in this case, rejecting Mary's authorship for Percy's, it just tells me that they lack imagination. Like, have you ever been in a creative collaboration ever? Like, Percy was obviously a large influence in Mary's work, just as Percy was influenced by Mary's father and other prominent writers. They certainly spoke extensively, living together in matrimony, but to use that to discredit Mary is deeply sexist and disillusioned. It is not revolutionary to be a contrarian. Look, I'm gonna have to cut this section off here because I will get too into the weeds. In my research, I stumbled upon a certain pseudo-scholar that seemed to make it a pillar of his life's work to independently take down centuries of established literary consensus by discrediting Mary Shelley, and he makes me inordinately frustrated. Misogyny and classism disguised as scholarship really pisses me off. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, Shakespeare wrote his plays. Moving on. Now I'm going to dive into the differences between the two main versions, the original and the revised 1831 edition. Elizabeth Lavenza is not Victor's cousin in the 1831 rewrite. She is found and adopted by the family when she is a few years old and raised alongside Victor and his brothers, but they are not blood related in the updated version. Interestingly, Mary wrote another short novel called Mathilde, or Matilda, not published in her lifetime, that has incest in it as well, though it is not a reciprocated sort of thing, as it appears to be in Frankenstein, and it is between a father and a daughter. She wrote it while in a depression from the death of one of her children. I was reading a long Tumblr post about how the 1818 version is meant to be a critique of incest, as well as a potential airing out of Percy Shelley's own incest issues. Ugh. I'll get more into Percy Shelley's issues later, and I'll link the Tumblr post in the description. I simply have too much to talk about in this video to get into the weeds with that particular interpretation of the Elizabeth-Victor dynamic, but I do think it's worth a ponder for sure. It's not really something I thought much about when reading it, but it's definitely worth thinking about and analyzing. There's a shift in the 1831 edition towards the idea of Victor being the victim of a predetermined fate instead of chance, circumstance, and individual choices determining how things unfolded. Now, I still feel like fate is a large part of Victor's perspective in the 1818 version, but that language comes in at the end mainly, whereas in the 1831 version, the language of fate is present much earlier, especially when he was beginning his work at the University of Ingolstadt. Some of Mary's more radical ideas about retributive justice, a la Elizabeth's tirade against the death penalty, in the 1818 version is not present in the 1831 edition. Also, Clerval wants fame and power in the 1831 edition, as opposed to being pure and morally superior in the 1818 version. There are a few more changes, but those are the big ones, and I will link an article in the description with a list of the literal changes that someone was studious enough to draw up by going back and forth page by page. I'm gonna be honest that I don't know if, besides the details about Elizabeth, I would have noticed too much of a difference between the two without reading them side by side, page by page. However, I do think that the 1831 preface is fabulous. But I'm also a stickler for an original version. I want the messier, rawer version of a piece of art. So my vote is the 1818 version with the 1831 preface tacked on. That is my perfect version for a first read of the text. I spoke a bit about Mary's life before she wrote Frankenstein in the introduction video, but for those who haven't seen that, I'll go over some of those details again. Mary Godwin was born on August 30th, 1797, to prominent political philosopher William Godwin and famous writer and feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. Her parents were known for their radical ideas and unconventional lifestyles. Mary Wollstonecraft moved to Paris in the middle of the French Revolution, tried to kill herself twice, and already had another child outside of wedlock named Fanny Imlay. Fanny was 3 years old when Mary was born. Mary Wollstonecraft unfortunately died just 10 days after giving birth to Mary. This was something that affected Mary her whole life. William Godwin remarried in 1801, and his new wife brought 2 children of her own into the house, Charles and Jane Clairmont. Jane later went by Claire, so I will just call her Claire for clarity's sake. Stupid, sorry. Mary never received a traditional education, but was educated at home by her father. She was also often privy to conversations between her father and his friends, which included famous poets and prominent thinkers of the 17th century. For reasons of health, as well as to keep the peace in their often tense household, Mary was sent away to Scotland when she was 14. She describes these years of her life fondly in the 1831 preface of Frankenstein. They were the eyrie of freedom, and the pleasant region where unheeded I could commune with the creatures of my fancy. When Mary returned to England, she met Percy Bysshe Shelley, who had recently been kicked out of Oxford, was a notorious atheist, and was a devout follower of the work of William Godwin. The Godwins were flailing financially, and Shelley often gave them money despite not really having much to give, as his father disapproved of his reputation and was not very free with purse strings. Often Percy would borrow from lenders based on the fact that they knew he would inherit his father's large estate, so he would have to pay them back with heavy interest after he inherited. This was called a post-obit loan. Mary and Percy fell in love quickly, despite Percy being already married, and they planned to run away together in 1814. Mary was 16 and Percy was 21. They often took long walks together to read poetry over the grave of Mary's mother. It is rumored that Percy and Mary first had sex on her mother's grave after declaring their love for each other. How on brand for them. When they revealed their relationship to Mary's father, expecting him to be supportive given his unconventional views on marriage, they were surprised with his anger and disapproval. He forbade them from seeing each other, and Mary was kept to the third level of their house, not allowed to leave. Percy's anguish grew, and one day he broke into the room where Mary was kept with a pistol and a bottle of laudanum. He told her to drink it, and he would shoot himself. "They wish to separate us, my beloved, but death shall unite us." Clearly he had internalized Romeo and Juliet just a little too much. Luckily, Mary refused. After a few more weeks of separation, the two lovers ran away together to France. Claire, Mary's stepsister, joined them. Their journey was long and arduous and difficult, and they had to return to England just a few months later, exhausted and out of money. Upon their return, Mary was treated as an outcast. Friends and family, including her father, didn't acknowledge her on the street. She was pregnant by now, and it was considered immoral and improper to be living with a married man and having his child as an unwed woman. There is so much more, but I fear this video will be 2 hours long if I give all the details, so I'm going to speed the biography up a little bit. Mary's baby was delivered prematurely in late February of 1815, and just 10 days later, the baby died in her sleep. Mary wrote in her journal, "I think of my little dead baby. This is foolish, I suppose, yet whenever I am left alone to my thoughts and do not read to divert them, they always come back to the same point, that I was a mother, and am so no longer." In the summer of 1816, Mary, Percy, and Claire joined their friend Lord Byron and his physician John Polidori at his summer villa in Italy, Villa Diodati. Claire was desperately in love with Byron, but he found her annoying. She was pregnant with his child at this time. Mary also had given birth again earlier that year to a son named William. It was known as the Year Without a Summer due to an eruption from Mount Tambora in modern-day Indonesia the previous year. The weather across the globe was cold, unpredictable, and unfavorable, and the group was confined indoors much of the time. They read ghost stories by the fire and had rousing conversations about science and galvanism. One evening, Lord Byron challenged the group, "We will each write a ghost story." In the 1831 Frankenstein preface, Mary describes being unable to come up with a story for several days, until one night she has a vivid dream of the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. "I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion." The dream frightens her, and with encouragement from Percy, she turns the dream into a longer piece than she initially thought. In less than a year, she would have the manuscript of her debut novel, Frankenstein. During the year that she was writing Frankenstein, she is subjected to many life-altering events. Her half-sister Fanny commits suicide. Percy's first wife commits suicide, which does free Percy and Mary to marry, which they do. Their third child, Clara, dies several weeks after birth from dysentery, and Percy and Mary publish a joint travel narrative called History of a 6 Weeks Tour. Frankenstein is published anonymously in January of 1818. Mary's life after publishing Frankenstein takes a further downturn quite quickly. In 1819, Mary and Percy's son William dies of malaria in Italy at 3 years old. They now have no living children. But Mary is pregnant with a fourth, which she gives birth to in November of that year. They name that son Percy, and it is their only child to live to adulthood. Every time you come across an anti-vaxxer, just have them read about the life of Mary Shelley and how she lost 4 of her 5 children, mainly to preventable infectious disease. In 1822, Mary nearly dies from a miscarriage, but Percy has her sit on ice to stop the bleeding, which saves her life. A month later, in July 1822, Percy drowns while sailing. He was 29, and Mary is now a widow at 25. After he is cremated, she keeps a piece of his calcified heart wrapped in his poetry in the drawer of her portable writing desk for the rest of her life. In 1823, Valperga, her second novel, is published. Also in 1823, a second edition of Frankenstein, edited by her father William Godwin, is published. Due to Godwin's edits, it's not considered an authoritative text. This version bears Mary's name. Also, the first dramatic adaptation of the novel, called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, opens at the English Opera House. The creature is unnamed in the playbill, just credited as ... played by the actor T.P. Cook, and he's painted blue and is mute. This adaptation also introduces the character Fritz, often named in later adaptations as Igor, Frankenstein's assistant. This diffuses some of the responsibility and isolation that Victor experiences in the novel. It was definitely a very loose adaptation. I've included a link to the script in the description, and you can see my bibliography for further reading on this adaptation if you are so inclined. In 1824, Lord Byron dies of malaria in Greece. In 1826, Mary publishes her novel The Last Man, a novel where it appears that Mary is grappling with the grief of unexpected and traumatic death, and the isolation of being the only one left alive of those you once knew and loved. There are characters modeled after Percy, Lord Byron, and herself in the novel. Much of the rest of Mary's life is consumed by trying to make ends meet by writing, raising her son Percy, and furthering the renown and public opinion of her late husband's poetry. When Percy died, he was known more for his scandalous personal life than his poetry. But through Mary's work, editing and publishing his poems in a collection, more and more people became aware of Percy Shelley as a genius of romantic poetry. He is now remembered alongside her and Lord Byron as great literary figures from the Romantic era. But I think it's interesting how Mary has outshone them all over time, at least in fame and continued relevance. She has honestly outshone pretty much everyone in her life, both of her famous parents, her famous husband, her famous friends. She was surrounded by excellent writers and thinkers, and many underestimated her during her life, but ultimately, Frankenstein has become one of our modern myths. It's kind of funny how things work like that, through chance and circumstance. Certain works just kind of rise to the top. Mary died at the age of 53 after being ill for quite some time. Her death was likely due to a brain tumor. She was survived only by her stepsister Claire, her son Percy, and his wife Jane. If you want an easy-to-read but thorough biography of Mary Shelley, I read and enjoyed this book by Catherine Reef. It is detailed, easy to follow, and is really good about sticking to the fact instead of speculation. Look, I love speculation, but this was a good way to understand what we know about Mary's life from the hard evidence we have. It doesn't delve much into Claire's supposed affair with Percy, or Percy's insistence on Mary taking a lover, or any of the more scandalous rumors about their lives. It focuses on what we know to be true, which is a great place to start if you're interested in reading more for yourself. As with pretty much everything in this video, it will be linked in the description, or even better, check it out from the library. Another resource available if you are interested in going on your own personal deep dive into the world of Mary Shelley is the Godwin Shelley archive that I briefly mentioned earlier in the video. Additionally, one of the sources I used frequently throughout this whole series was a resource made through the University of Pennsylvania. I will link it below. It looks like an old GeoCity site, only text on an unsettling yellow background, but it is chock full of information and helpful articles, context, and definitions. I talked about this a little bit in the last video, but one of the most commonly repeated phrases in Frankenstein is, "I cannot describe to you, ... and usually is followed by Victor or the creature talking about how they cannot adequately describe to the reader or listener their feelings at a certain moment in the story. This is fascinating because there is a deep well of emotion in this story already. I feel like half of the book is Victor describing his agony in great detail, but Mary Shelley giving her characters this feeling of inability to articulate suggests an even deeper storm of emotions that the reader cannot access. There's almost a conveyance of fundamental misunderstanding, which makes sense, right? The whole book, Victor is telling his honestly unbelievable story to Robert Walton. He probably feels like he's fighting to be believed, as he knows he sounds crazy. So the urgency in his language betrays a deep fear of being misunderstood by his friend, and therefore by us. The creature feels the same way. And while his story and circumstances are different from Victor's, the violence of his feelings and the language with which he communicates them, much more eloquently than Victor, I would say, betrays the same fear of being misunderstood and cast aside. You know, it really is like when a parent and child keep fighting because they refuse to see that the reason that they fight is because they use the same tactics and have the same faults and fears. It's giving father and son. Like I said, Victor's ineloquence is much worse than the creature's. Arguably because we hear directly from Victor way more. You know, for as long as the book is, there is comparatively little dialogue. It is mostly Victor's inner monologue and ramblings. We know very little about the other characters' feelings, what they look like, the subtleties of their lives. Of course, this is intensely revealing about Victor. Mary Shelley does a wonderful job in painting the portrait of a pathetic and self-absorbed tortured poet. Sorry, scientist? I guess? And of course, I'm not the first or only person to notice this. James R. Kincaid wrote about this in a piece from 1990 called Words Cannot Express, Frankenstein's Tripping on the Tongue. Kincaid says, Victor tends to lose his dictionary every time things get interesting. Apparently not trusting his ability to cull his words with the choicest art, he lets Justine go hang, although he isn't happy about it. No one can conceive the anguish I suffered. I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt, ... Words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. He admits some responsibility for these deeds of mischief beyond description, but even that confession does not make the words flow with the rapidity and clarity Walton had promised us. I was seized with remorse and the sense of guilt which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. He confronts the creature a bit later with the accusation that his ungrateful progeny has made him wretched beyond expression, leaving it a matter of doubt whether the creature might not bear responsibility for the tongue-tying as well as the wretchedness. Whatever the cause, things do not improve. Victor reacts to the creature's long monologue by being unable to describe, being at a loss, even in my own heart, to find an expression for his sensations. He does pretty well with trees and rocks from time to time, but repeated shocks throw Victor back into the land of the wordless. On seeing Henry's corpse, how can I describe my sensations on beholding it? On Elizabeth's, a sensation of horror not to be described. But I also find it interesting that Mary herself was misunderstood for the majority of her life, often by those closest to her. Despite the tragedies she suffered, she had a stoic presence, and did not express her despair outwardly, but seemed witty, lively, and pleasantly conversant to those who visited and dined with her. Many people even thought she had stopped loving Shelley towards the end of his life. Shelley contributed to this perspective, but that is like a whole other story. Percy? But it was simply not true. So I feel that there is a clear parallel between Mary's fear of being misunderstood and her inability to convey her innermost feelings with the fears and inabilities of her characters. The more I learn about Mary's life, the more I understand Frankenstein, and vice versa. Look, there are many lenses through which to read and interpret Frankenstein. It can be read as a commentary on slavery, a plea for outcasts, an anti-AI warning for scientists and entrepreneurs, a feminist critique of a man trying to create life without a woman, or a more general religious critique of man trying to play God. The list goes on. All of these lenses are rich and interesting and worth their own videos. But the one I am personally invested in is much more intimate than any of those. Mary wrote Frankenstein at age 18 and 19. When I think back to that age, I was creating things, following impulses, but not always understanding where that impulse or inspiration came from. Same with actions. I'm sure you can pick out this pattern in your younger self too, or heck, maybe your current self. And if we're not yet self-aware enough to see it in ourselves, we see it in others. Basically, I'm saying that maybe Mary didn't always explicitly understand every facet of her brilliance, that her intent might not have been to write an abolitionist book, or a warning for scientists, or a feminist manifesto. Despite its dipping its toes into all of those things, her preface in the 1831 edition leads me to believe that the book was far more personally and politically revealing than Mary intended it to be. That when it was published, she didn't necessarily have a grasp on its full power. I think this is true for many young artists. It isn't until they get older that they see the power of their own intellect and can grasp it fully. And that can be true at any age. You know, the older version of ourselves is always more able to understand the actions and ideas of our younger selves than we can in that moment of action and creation. Like when I turned 25, I could feel my prefrontal cortex finally snap into full development. Likewise, Mary looks back on her younger creation with a bit of cringe, I want to say. In my mind, Mary was writing autobiographically almost. Her deepest fears were being massaged out in this novel, maybe even without her meaning to. Also her judgments of herself and of those closest to her. I fully believe she was criticizing the men in her life, intentionally or unintentionally. Perhaps she felt guilty for the death of Percy's first wife and judged his carelessness with which he had treated her and his children by her. She felt abandoned by her father when she was sent away to Scotland when she was 14, and when he went no contact with her for years after she ran away with Percy, despite still asking for money from them. She saw Claire's despair over Lord Byron's treatment of her and their child, who was taken away from Claire by Byron and died in a convent of 5 years old, by the way. In chapter 4 of her book, Mary Shelley, Her Life, Her Fiction, Her Monsters, Anne Meller says, Mary Shelley specifically associated her modern Prometheus with romantic poets she knew personally. During the summer in which she began writing Frankenstein, Byron composed his poem Prometheus, a celebration of the god's defiance of Jupiter, which emphasizes Prometheus's unyielding will, noble suffering, and concern for mankind's qualities with which Byron clearly identified himself. Mary Shelley copied this poem and carried it to Byron's publisher John Murray when she returned to England in August 1816. Byron's Promethean persona appeared again in Manfred, which Mary Shelley read soon after its publication on June 16, 1817. Manfred's Faustian thirst for unbounded experience, knowledge, and freedom leads him, like Victor Frankenstein, to steal the secrets of nature. As Manfred confesses, "I dived in my lone wanderings to the caves of death, searching its cause in its effect, and drew from withered bones and skulls and heaped up dust conclusions most forbidden." Manfred's quest also enchained him in a Promethean suffering for his lost sister, Astarte, a painful remorse that articulates Byron's guilty conscience over his incestuous affair with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. In his defiance of Arimanes, I'm probably butchering that, Arimanes, and all other deities, Manfred proclaims Byron's personal belief in the ultimate creative power and integrity of the human imagination, using phrases that Mary Shelley condensed into the single spark of being infused by her modern Prometheus into the lifeless creature at his feet. The mind, the spirit, the Promethean spark, the lightning of my being is as bright, pervading, and far-darting as your own, and shall not yield to yours, though cooped in clay. So, yeah, there's the incest thing with Lord Byron also. What the hell was going on with these romantic poets? Freud probably took one look at this group and was like, hubba hubba, I'm in business. In memes and internet culture, many people like to paint Lord Byron as the direct stand-in for Victor Frankenstein, and I think Mary certainly was inspired by his persona when creating Victor, as described above so eloquently by Anne Meller. But I think the strongest stand-in is meant to be Percy as Victor. While Mary loved Percy, he was mercurial, made her life infinitely harder, and was deeply unstable. Meller says, Victor was Percy Shelley's pen name for his first publication, original poetry by Victor and Césaire, published in 1810. Victor Frankenstein's family resembles Percy Shelley's. In both, the father is married to a woman young enough to be his daughter. In both, the oldest son has a favorite sister, adopted sister or cousin in Frankenstein's case, named Elizabeth. Meller elaborates later, like Percy Shelley's, Victor Frankenstein's strongest erotic desires are not so much for his putative lover as for his lost mother. Percy unwittingly revealed this incestuous desire during the troubled period after his expulsion from Oxford. Barred from his mother's and sister's company, he violently accused his mother of having an affair with his sister Elizabeth's music master, and of trying to conceal the affair by marrying Elizabeth to him. Percy seems here to have projected onto his innocent friend Edward Fergus Graham his own erotic fantasy, to be the lover of both mother and favorite sister. His efforts to marry Elizabeth to his best friend Hogg can be seen as yet another attempt to close the sexual circle between himself and his sister. Percy Shelley's persistent desire to be the sexual partner of every woman he admired was not only self-indulgent, it also revealed a fundamental inability to separate his ego from his mother's, and to function normally without the unquestioning emotional and sexual support of a devoted woman. Mary Shelley projected her irritation with this facet of Percy's character into her portrait of Victor Frankenstein. Yeesh. She goes on, more important, Victor Frankenstein embodies certain elements of Percy Shelley's temperament and character that had begun to trouble Mary Shelley. She perceived in Percy an intellectual hubris or belief in the supreme importance of mental abstractions that led him to be insensitive to the feelings of those who did not share his ideas and enthusiasms. The Percy Shelley that Mary knew and loved lived in a world of abstract ideas. His actions were primarily motivated by theoretical principles, the quest for perfect beauty, love, freedom, goodness. While Mary endorsed and shared these goals, she had come to suspect that in Percy's case, they sometimes masked an emotional narcissism, an unwillingness to confront the origins of his own desires or the impact of his demands on those most dependent upon him. Percy's pressure on Mary during the winter and spring of 1814-15 to take Hogg as a lover despite her sexual indifference to Hogg, his indifference to the death of Mary's first baby on March 7, 1815, his insistence on Claire's continuing presence in his household despite Mary's stated opposition, All this had alerted Mary to a worrisome strain of selfishness in Percy's character, an egotism that too often rendered him an insensitive husband and an uncaring, irresponsible parent. Mary witnessed the men in her life have grand, beautiful ideas and vision for humanity, but she critiqued that when it came down to the minutiae and details of day-to-day relationships and the work required to bring those ideas to fruition, they couldn't execute. They f***ed up. Mellor goes on to detail this pattern in not only Percy and Byron, but in Mary's father, her father's friends, and several of Mary's other acquaintances. Mary was not just critiquing the specific people in her life and their actions, but the consequences of pursuing their poetic ideals and worldview callously and without consideration for the actual circumstances of the actual world. When we place our ideals onto people, whether that is free love, focus on the eternal, or what have you, we ignore the emotional fallout, jealousy, grief, suffering. And not only that, but combine those noble ideas in a person with mommy issues, intimacy issues, and maybe some narcissism. Lethal combo if you don't have the self-awareness to check yourself. Mellor says it much better. Mary Shelley clearly perceived the inherent danger in a Promethean revolutionary ideology. Commitment to an abstract good can justify an emotional detachment from present human relationships and family obligations, a willingness to sacrifice the living to a cause whose final consequences cannot be fully controlled, and an obsession with realizing a dream that too often masks an egotistical wish for personal power. But this isn't a Percy Bysshe Shelley hate channel, because Mary wasn't only writing about Percy, or only writing about the men in her life. She was also writing about herself, about her fear of the power to create life and the responsibility to keep it alive, what we owe children and how we fail, how she failed her own dead newborn. She was writing about her feelings as an outcast when society and her own father disowned and abandoned her for years when she first ran away with Percy. And that outcast status never truly went away. She just found other outcasts and eccentric people to surround herself with. She casts herself as both victor and the creature, capable of creation and destruction in equal measure. Remember, her mother died so that Mary could live. She lived with the ghost of her mother following her throughout her life, for better or worse. She had a palpable relationship to the peril of bringing life into the world, as well as many of the griefs that being brought into it and not being properly cared for bring. Mary is not victor or the creature. She is both. And she distanced herself in that 1831 preface, because sometimes we have to work things out in our art that we cannot put a name to in our real life. That is part of why art exists, to understand ourselves and our human natures better, to experiment, to take horrible impulses and fears to their horrible ends in a fictional world where nobody is harmed, to enact fantasy so we can see how we feel about it, to criticize our society, peers, and even loved ones without having to do it to their faces. Oh, it was just a dream I had. Is better, easier, and more palatable for a woman in 1831 to say than to voice. I saw monsters inside the men I loved, and I had no way to tell them. Or, I was afraid of the monstrosity in myself, so I wrote it down instead. It would also be foolish to ignore the effect that losing almost all of her children, friends, and husband had on her and her work. I'm sure that part of why she distanced herself in the 1831 preface was because Percy, who she really took to task in that book, was now dead. And despite everything that I said was wrong with Percy Shelley, she never remarried. She said that she couldn't. She basically said that no one else would ever compare to him. Her letters after Percy's death are full of some of the most heart-wrenching prose I have ever heard. When I first read it, it felt like a 10-ton weight was like pressing on my chest. I'm gonna read a bit, so if you're in a fragile state of mind, maybe skip this part. September 10th, 1822, Mary Shelley's letter to Maria Gisborne. People used to call me lucky in my star. You see now how true such a prophecy is. I was fortunate in having fearlessly placed my destiny in the hands of one who, a superior being among men, a bright planetary spirit enshrined in an earthly temple, raised me to the height of happiness. So far am I now happy, that I would not change my situation as his widow with that of the most prosperous woman in the world. And surely the time will at length come when I shall be at peace, and my brain and heart no longer be alive with unutterable anguish. I will only say that all, except his heart, which was inconsumable, was burnt. and that 2 days ago I went to Leghorn and beheld a small box that contained his earthly dross. Those smiles, that form, great God, no, he is not there. He is with me, about me. Life of my life and soul of my soul. If his divine spirit did not penetrate mine, I could not survive to weep thus. Solitude is my only help and resource. Accustomed, even when he was with me, to spend much of my time alone, I can at those moments forget myself, until some idea, which I think I would communicate to him, occurs. And then the yawning and dark gulf again displays itself, unshaded by the rainbow which the imagination had formed. Despair, energy, love, desponding, and excessive affliction are like clouds driven across my mind, one by one, until tears blot the scene, and weariness of spirit consigns me to temporary repose. I shudder with horror when I look back on what I have suffered, and when I think of the wild and miserable thoughts that have possessed me, I say to myself, is it true that I ever felt thus? And then I weep in pity of myself. Yet each day adds to the stock of sorrow, and death is the only end. I would study, and I hope I shall. I would write, and when I am settled, I may. But were it not for the steady hope I entertain of joining him, what a mockery would be this world. Without that hope I could not study or write, for fame and usefulness, except as regards my child, are nullities to me. Yet I shall be happy if anything I ever produce may exalt and soften sorrow, as the writings of the divinities of our race have mine. But how can I aspire to that? September 17th, 1822. Mary Shelley to Maria Gisborne. Hope is a word that belongs not to my situation. He, my own beloved, the exalted and divine Shelley, has left me alone in this miserable world, this earth canopied by the eternal starry heaven, where he is, where, oh my God, yes, where I shall one day be. Those about me have no idea of what I suffer. None are sufficiently interested in me to observe that, though my lips smile, my eyes are blank, or to notice the desolate look that I cast up towards the sky. Pardon, dear friend, this selfishness in writing thus. There are moments when the heart must sfogare, or be suffocated, and such a moment is this, when, quite alone, my babe sleeping, and dear Jane having just left me, it is with difficulty I prevent myself from flying from mental misery by bodily exertion, when to run into that vast grave, the sea, until I sink to rest, would be a pleasure to me. And instead of this I write. And as I write, I say, "Oh God, have pity on me." At least I will have pity on you. Good night. I will finish this when people are about me and I am in a more cheerful mood. Good night. I will go look to the stars. They are eternal. So is he. And so am I. I think it would be a mistake to say that Mary did not love Percy very, very much. So now what? You've read, dissected, and pondered, and maybe that's enough for you. Maybe you didn't like the novel, or didn't agree with the ideas in it, or it wasn't to your taste. Maybe you have zero desire to engage with it ever again. Though if that's you, and you stuck with the whole series all the way to the end of this video, I am both shocked, impressed, and very flattered. But whether you loved it, you hated it, or felt kind of middle of the road about it, I challenge you to do one more thing to engage with it, and that is to create something of your own as a reaction to it. You don't have to be an artist or a writer in order to do this. It doesn't have to be any good. It just has to be yours. Maybe rewrite a scene from the novel from a different character's perspective. Draw your own idea of what the characters looked like. Create a comic, write a short play or a film script. Make a collage. And it can be as general or specific as you want. Maybe you set a short story in the Swiss Alps and explore nature as a larger component in that story. Maybe you write an essay on the dangers of unchecked AI. Maybe you create a video essay about the publishing industry in the early 1800s in England. Perhaps you write a poem imitating the style of Lord Byron or Percy Shelley. Perhaps you write your own ghost story. I'm in the process of writing a play about the Villa Diodati gang. It will never see the light of day because I'm sure it's been done before and it's trash, but I'm having fun. It's making me think a lot about the influences Mary's friends and experiences had on her writing. Also, I created this whole series because I was so moved by this novel and I wanted to share those feelings with others. You don't have to sink like 80 plus hours of your life into your creation like I did, but you can if you want. I think my next move is to go through all the film adaptations of Frankenstein. I've only ever seen Young Frankenstein and the 1910 Edison film. I need to watch the Boris Karloff version and the Kenneth Branagh one. That's my homework for myself. What we choose to create can tell us a lot about what resonated most in ourselves about the novel itself, and the ideas that are most important and inspiring to us. Thoughtful, considered consumption of culturally relevant and critically acclaimed works of art and literature is wonderful. But to me, what is even more wonderful is what we then do with those ideas and thoughts that are sparked in us. What do we keep, and what do we reject from the things that we consume? What resonates so much with us that it's the thing that we have to talk about to others? Do we move through the world differently, making different choices based on the wisdom we gain from the stories that we consume? It's important to interrogate why we did or did not like something that we saw, read, or heard, especially if you sunk hours into ingesting and understanding it. And like I said earlier, creation can be a very good way to understand and process the deeper impact something had on us. Consuming and analyzing art is inherently vulnerable. Like I said, the things we choose to talk about, the themes we take away from what we consume, reveals a lot about ourselves. Someone who thinks the most interesting part of Frankenstein is the defiance of nature versus someone who thinks the most interesting part is the critique of scientific malpractice are two very different people. A person who relates to the creature versus someone who relates to Victor are two very different people. Someone who loves the novel versus someone who hates the novel are two very different people. We reveal ourselves in the things that we love as well as the things that we hate. Engaging with art is all about opening ourselves up to be seen by a story across time, place, and circumstance. It is so cool that Mary Shelley, a 19-year-old outcast in early 1800s England, made something that has reached across centuries to grasp us and make us feel in this moment. I feel like we owe it to her to pass that on. So, if you made it this far, thank you for joining me on this ride through Frankenstein. I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, I would love to hear about it in the comments. I'm gonna take a week off, and then I will see you for the next one.